Day 3, preseason football, Mississippi State. Steve, we've had a chance to watch a couple of practices so far, and I know it goes without saying sometimes, but I'm going to say it. They look like a football team. One of the great changes over the last couple of years. You see the results of good recruiting, good strength and conditioning development, and now Joe Moorhead and squad, they've hit the field out there, and they really look ready to go as they dive into this fast and intense August preseason.
You know, we wondered with Anthony Paroli returning to the program what type of system they would have, but the team clearly looks to be a little trimmer, but at the same time more athletic. Colin Hill is a guy that really kind of jumps out as a guy that's really kind of changed his body. Some of the freshmen, Cameron Jones is a guy showed up here in June and already looks to have transformed himself physically. We don't expect him to contribute this year, but I think it just says this staff has done a great job identifying the workouts possible that they need to kind of move this thing forward. Very impressive forward to look at the team.
And let's give credit where credit is due to the previous staff for recruiting a lot of these athletes that now, some of them mid-career, some of them in the career, but they've really matured their bodies, their mentalities, and they're approaching practice with a more aggressive attitude. It's really showing out there. And one area I was noticing in particular, the quarterbacks. Everybody wants to watch the quarterbacks. You look at those 3 scholarship quarterbacks. They look like tight ends. They have those kind of bodies out there. In today's spread-type offense, a quarterback who can do that and run over people is just about priceless. Not just Nick Fitzgerald, but Keaton Thompson can do that. And of course, Jalen Maiden, I think that kid looks really impressive well for a true freshman.
He does, David. And we've learned from experience that if you're going to have 5'10", 175-pound quarterbacks in Mississippi State, you better have a lot of them. This group a much different dynamic because, as you mentioned, David, you're kind of recruiting the skill, but you're also recruiting size. 6'4", 6'5", very, very big athletic group. Nick Fitzgerald, of course, that's really the story of the offseason. What's his recovery like? And I'll tell you, he looks the worse for wear. Now, Nick, if Nick was that one, he wouldn't tell you anyway. He's just that kind of character. But he does look good. His mobility looks good. He doesn't appear to have any lingering effects from the injury. He did confess there is some tightness at times after practice, but we expect that with an injury that gruesome to have some type of carryover. But excited about where he is, and certainly expect him to be 100% when Stephen F. Austin comes to town. And
some of the tightness would come from the extra tape that he wears on that right ankle just to protect it. It maybe affects his mobility just a little bit in practice. That will not be an issue come game time. And by the way, as he told us, his first play of this preseason camp, he took the snap, tucked it, and ran. Yes, there was no defense chasing, but he wanted to show that, had the footwork, and he had no worries at all. Keaton, of course, doing well. Maiden, who we mentioned, the offensive staff around him, the skilled personnel. Everybody wants to ask about the wide receiver, Steve. We're going to hit some highlights on some of the freshmen we've seen in camp, and one freshman receiver has really jumped out to you.
Devontae Jason, better known as WAP to many people on GeneSpec 247, but he doesn't look like a freshman. I don't mean just from a physical standpoint, just the way he approaches practice. He is very, very mature. He's been here since January, so none of this is new. His head's not swimming. He's ready to go. But he's a guy we expect to make an immediate contribution to Mississippi State. It's certainly a position of need at wide receiver. But you're almost in a situation where you've almost went out and signed some free agents. You get a Keith Mixon back who's approaching 100%. You get Malik Deer back who should be 100%. That position last year completely, David, a rebuild all the way. With Fred Ross moving on, Gabe Miles being injured, Donald Gray being injured. We had a couple of games last year, you had 4 active wide receivers. You had to have Osiris Mitchell and Reggie Todd as starters. And so a much different situation this year. We expect a lot more from that group, and I believe Stephen Guidry and Devontae Jason will lead the way.
And you mentioned Stephen Guidry, and he's looked very good so far. Maybe he needs to stay off social media a little bit sometimes, but physically he looks great out there. You mentioned Malik Deer, Keith Mixon, both slot receivers, with Dedrick Thomas, a returning player at the slot position, and now Austin Williams, who I saw make a great catch today in practice, which has almost become the norm for him, expected. Just the talent they have to work with the slot position is just ridiculous. But now it's time for guys like Jamal Couch, Osiris Mitchell, and others. Don't forget Jesse Jackson. I think he had a great spring camp and should be fine for this as well. Offensively, also, the offensive line, no changes in the first 2 deep there. None would be expected, certainly, over the summer season. Good numbers, good depth, and good experience, and you get the 2 JUCO guys now in full strength. Defensive line, it's just vicious. I mean, you sit there and go, you and I and Gene could probably call the defense for that defensive line.
That's true, David. And we've mentioned some of the great defensive lines in Mississippi State history. The '81 group, of course, with Glenn Collins, Johnny Cooks, Billy Jackson. Those guys, the '99 group with Mario Hagan and Willie Blade. The list goes on and on. This is one of the better groups, and I think when you look at it,
and the deepest by far.
That's exactly the next point I was about to make. As those groups were great frontliners, this is a group that goes 2 and 3 deep at every position, and you feel so good about where you are because you can rotate guys and keep them fresh. But we all know that when the game is on the line, guys like Montez Sweat, Jeffrey Simmons are going to be in the ball game.
And the defense is, of course, Brian Baker is figuring out his big challenge now is to how to get all those guys in the field with all their ability and talents. And if you're going to watch one question mark, it'd be the secondary, obviously, because you lost some guys, but you have talent coming back. The safety position should be fine now between Mark McLaurin, Jonathan Abram, and Brian Cole, all coming off his redshirt year. Cornerbacks, that's where your question marks remain, but this is the year for Jamal Peters to show his stuff out there. You've got Chris Rayford at a strong spring, but I'll tell you what, and we'll say this often all season, the key to that cornerback position is that defensive front. They should make their life a lot easier.
Absolutely, David. And when you don't have to cover a couple seconds, life is a little easier for everybody. But Cameron Dancer is a guy that we're expecting to hold down one of the cornerback spots as a starter this year. Possibility Chris Rayford may actually rotate to safety some just to give State some depth there. But you feel really good about Jamal Peters and Cam Dancer as guys who played a lot of snaps last year. Now it's time for them to take the next step. And as you mentioned, David, that's a group you feel pretty good about the frontline guys. Not a lot of depth behind them, and that's what fall camp's going to have to do is build some depth.
Of course, Steve talked about Watt being his favorite freshman so far, just kind of picking the offensive side. Defensively, I'm looking at Marcus Murphy.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, the guy has the skills to play on the offensive side of the ball, but he's wearing number 7, so you can't do that unless you sub the quarterback out. But speaking of which, Coach Moorhead said in Atlanta at SEC Media Days, they are looking at plans to quite possibly have both Fitzgerald and Thompson on the field at the same time. So you think about the creativity this shows. Now, we're not getting to watch many of the team-on-team drills. We won't get to watch any of the scrimmages. Moorhead has opened the early periods to it, so we can go watch the position drills, kind of give you an idea of depth charts here as it goes on. Paul Jones, Steve, Gene, and myself will be keeping an eye on those things for moves. And nobody injured so far, as best we can tell among the scholarship guys after 3 days. But the full gear goes on in 2 more days. And then you start getting a real read on what they're doing as they start hitting each other. We have Media Day this coming Saturday, where we get to talk to all the position assistants, update some things as well. But Steve, just in general, if you had to say one thing you're going to watch for the next week or so, as they're still shaking things out, is there one position you really want to look at?
Well, I think who's going to be the starting wide receivers. I mean, you return some guys that, Jesse Jackson was your leading receiver a year ago with just 27 catches, but you've had some guys, you almost feel like if you've recruited a whole other crop of receivers in here, how this thing will shake out, because Joe Moorhead has said he's not real big on changing personnel and tipping the defense off. He likes to run the same personnel over and over and over. Does that mean that Stephen Guidry, Devontae Jason, and maybe Austin Williams supplant some of these returning players and just have a completely new starting lineup of wide receiver? Or do you have a guy like Jesse Jackson or Keith Mixon that starts and then rotates other guys? That's, I think, the biggest question we got moving forward is kind of how all that's going to work.
The position I'll be trying to keep an eye on will be the linebacker. Oh, you feel great about the starting linebacker positions again with Leo Lewis, Errol Thompson, and Willie Gay back there, but where's the depth coming from? There's got to be some new kids out there, some people have been waiting their turn, but that's also where the 3 safety system will come in handy. And one other position to watch, kick return. We have always seen us practices on a few things, but Malik Deer is your #1 kick returner with Dedrick Thomas, Keith Mixon in the mix, and others. They're going to look for a playmaker, because I think Joe Moorhead, by hiring Joey Jones, he wants to make plays in the special teams this year. So, a lot of things to keep track of. Steve and I will be talking as this goes on, giving you more of this material. Again, we're providing daily updates as possible, what we get. Tomorrow we interview offensive staff. I'll be talking to offensive linemen. Steve has his list of interview requests. Paul has those. So we'll be getting material to you as it goes on. So anyway, what we've seen is fall camp's underway, and there's so much else to talk about. I know Gene wants to sooner or later get around to the baseball, what's happening there, particularly with the results of the draft. Over our shoulder there, you can see a magnificent stadium taking shape further. And big news from the basketball side, both the women who are headed for Italy, Coach Ben Howland's team. Basically, summer's over, Steve. It's time to get back to work as we cover Bulldog sports for Gene's Page 24/7. So for Gene Swindoll, Paul Jones, Robbie Falk, and Mike Nemeth, and Steve Robertson, this is David Murray.